Good morning. Thanks for joining us. I hope everybody had a great weekend. Welcome to week 4 of the NCAA mentorship program that we've set up in partnership with the AHCA Women's Hockey Committee. This week's theme is looking at the role of an assistant coach in creating and maintaining team culture. Today's session will include a presentation from Bethany Browson, the assistant coach for the University of Minnesota Women's Hockey, followed by an open dialogue with our NHLCA mentor coach, and then we will open it up to a Q&A period from all of you guys listening on the line afterwards. The second session this Friday will include a presentation from our NHLCA mentor coach, followed by an open Q&A again. Thank you to Ryan Craig, the assistant coach for the Vegas Golden Knights, for being our mentor coach this week. We thought actually that Bethany and Ryan would be great to partner together specifically on this topic because they're both only a few years out of their playing career and both in their first roles with their first team. So we thought that was some good symmetry there. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items. The webinar is being recorded and you will automatically receive a copy of the recording 24 hours following the live event. Please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any point, and we encourage you to do so with your name so that we can get a great conversation going. Before we get going, I did just want to say a big thank you to everybody who's been involved over the past few weeks. It's been so wonderful spending Mondays and Fridays with the group, getting to know a lot of you much better, setting up these relationships that I've really seen form between the NCAA coach and our NHL coaches. And just all of the sharing of information and experience and insights and knowledge has really been incredible. So thank you to Bethany today and to Lee, Cassie, Liz, as well as to Ryan, Todd, Jamie, and Gully. We'll have Mayor McDougall join us on Friday as well to say a few words as we wrap up the program, but I think I'm going to miss it as we wrap up this final week. Okay, let's get going. Bethany has just completed her 4th year as the assistant coach for the University of Minnesota Women's Hockey Program. She joined the coaching staff in 2016 after competing for the Gophers for 4 years between 2010 to 14. Prior to joining the Gophers coaching staff, Bethany spent 2 seasons serving as an assistant coach with the Breck High School girls hockey program where she worked with the team's forwards. Bethany did her undergraduate studies in psychology before completing a master's in psychology at the University of Minnesota. She has done work in sports psychology and will look to begin her doctorate program in the fall in organizational leadership. As a 4-year letter winner and 2-time captain with the Gophers, Bethany was part of the back-to-back national championship teams in 2012 and 2013, along with Minnesota's national runner-up team in 2014. Bethany, thanks so much for being here today. We're really looking forward to your presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Lindsay, for just that introduction. Probably more than I deserved, but I appreciate it. And just thank you again to NHLCA for putting this whole thing on. I know I've heard just about every coach mention how it's been a extremely fantastic process for everybody. And I couldn't agree more. Working with Ryan has been a really good opportunity for me personally, and just partnering with the NHLCA in general has been fantastic. So we really appreciate it. And then also have to shout out Mayor. Thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this process as well. So kind of as we're in this weird time of life, obviously everyone touches on that, and just being in this pandemic has been, I know, a weird time of life for everyone, and has been tough in a lot of different ways. So I hope everyone is doing well with their families. And I do look at it personally as a way to maybe connect in a new way. I know for me, I've been lucky to had some people reach out, even a few coaches this morning, just wishing me good luck. So obviously, as hard as it's been, has been a new opportunity and different to connect in some new ways. So hopefully everyone is doing well. So as Lindsay had mentioned, the way that I'd like to actually start to kind of kick off my presentation around culture and an assistant coach role in that would start with my personal journey. And so my freshman year, I started at Minnesota in 2010, graduated in 2014. And my freshman year was kind of an interesting one. And Brad and Joel may not love that I tell this part of the story, but I think it's really critical to actually explain my own journey. And so when I started in 2010, I came to Minnesota and we had a pretty good season. I think we had 8 or 10 losses on the year. And then we ended up facing BC in the quarterfinal game. We actually dropped that game 4-1 and kind of just got our doors blown off, to be honest. When we went out there, it wasn't a real good game. We didn't really show up. It was a tough loss for us. And what I noticed is in the locker room after the game, it just seemed more like a business approach. We had lost the game, and it was kind of like, okay, let's pack up the bags and let's head home. And coming from a high school experience where you would lose a game and not necessarily proud to admit this, but you'd lose your last game of the high school season and you would just be devastated. I mean, for 2-3 days, it felt like it was tough to go to school. And so it was a very different experience for me my freshman year, going to the college level. And I just remember wondering if that was normal and if that was my kind of my new experience that I would be having. And so that was kind of a tough transition for me. And then everything took a turn for the better my sophomore year. We ended up winning the national championship that year, actually. And in a way that was a little bit kind of an unsung hero. We weren't necessarily expected to win. And I don't even know that the team necessarily believed we were going to win either. But what had happened that year, I vividly remember we had a Bemidji series, actually, and we went up to Bemidji. And on the way home, Sarah Erickson, who you can see her in the bottom left corner there, kind of front center, she was one of our captains that year. And she had texted me while we were on the bus. And she said, hey, can you come sit with me? So I walk back there, I sit with her, and she starts talking to me about all these things. And she's telling me that she's been working with the coaches, and what we want to do is revamp and change our culture. And so I'm sitting there, I'm kind of nodding, and she's telling me about this new idea that we're going to create these values and we're going to live them out and all this stuff. And they were words and things I had heard before because we'd talked about them previously. They were hanging on our walls, but it was never really an intentional conversation about how we'd actually live our lives. And so Sarah brought this up to me, and she said, I think I can get the upperclassmen on board, but what I really need your help with is to get the underclassmen on board. And I was like, yeah, great. What she probably didn't know at the time is that in my head, I was like, I have no idea what the hell she's talking about with this culture stuff. And so for me, it was this really interesting segue or kind of exposure to culture in the first time for me. So when we actually returned to campus, we did some follow-up and had some more conversations about what that was actually going to look like. And then as time progressed, we were actually moving into playoffs around then. And again, this is something most people don't know about that sophomore season, but we actually had a teammate whose sister passed away unexpectedly. And for the first time, really, with that group, we came together in a new way, a very authentic, a very rich way. And I think for the first time, we realized how much we were actually there for each other and how much the culture actually showed up. And so that was that sophomore season we went on to win. And then my junior year is, ironically, it's the one that everyone always wants to talk about. It's the undefeated year. We won a national championship at home and had kind of that quote unquote perfect season. And what's so interesting to me is every time that I look back and think about the culture and what was developed, I think of the sophomore year and never the junior year. And the junior year to me was a trickle down effect of what happened that sophomore season. And then my senior year, we had another really successful year. Our winning streak had continued into the fall, and we ended up losing a game. I think it was game 62 or 63, something like that, to North Dakota. And then we went on to win out until the national championship game against Clarkson, which we lost that one. And so that's kind of a little bit of a background to my personal journey with leadership and culture in particular, and how that developed for us, and where my passion in that area comes from, really being rooted in my past experience. So for me, when we look a little bit deeper at what culture really is, this is a personal philosophy of mine. It's not rooted in any research by any stretch of the imagination, but to me, culture is really kind of this cyclical cycle, if you want to think about it that way. To me, I think that for culture within a group or organization or a team, I kind of coin it to be in one of three types of phases. And it doesn't necessarily mean that one follows the other, but I do think that most groups fall in one of these categories. I think that from a kind of phase one type of idea, typically there's a building and kind of a creating type of phase. And for me, as my personal experience would show, I think that was kind of 2010 to 2012 in our program. I wrote on here the honeymoon phase because I think that that's when culture is almost easiest to develop in some ways. It's new, it's fresh, it's different, and teams are really excited about it. I think if you're not in that phase, you could be in kind of a retention phase. So that, again, looking at my experience, I think I would call that 2012 to 2016, actually after I graduated. So when I look at our team, I think that that was a big, heavy phase that we've been in recently. And I think that this is where kind of that honeymoon phase is over. It's not necessarily that new or that exciting or different necessarily. You might have seniors on the team who've been hearing the same thing for 4 years. And so I wrote down here, it can be a lot of hard work if you're in this phase, because again, it's that your culture is in a healthy spot, but there's a lot of intentionality between, retaining and modifying your culture as it's needed. I also added kind of in this phase, when you get to the top of your game, you change it. That's actually from a book, Legacy. I'd be surprised if a lot of the coaches on the call haven't actually read this book. But they say when you get to the top of your game, change it. What's interesting about that is I actually read like the first 50 pages of this book and I hated that quote. I was like, I won't put this book down. I disagree. I put blueprint of success. That's kind of how I always looked at strong culture. I thought, once you develop a strong culture, you just keep doing the same things. And this retention phase, I would now make the argument after learning some of these things that when you do get to the top of your game, it's important that you change it when it comes to culture. It doesn't mean if it's in a healthy spot that you change everything and revamp the whole thing, but you do need to make modifications to keep it new, keep it fresh. That kind of leads into the third phase here, and I believe that could be like a rebuilding or reinventing phase for a group. And so to me, in our current program, I think that from 2016 to now, in some ways, I think that's where we are. It doesn't mean that you have necessarily a bad culture, but it might not be exactly what you want it to be, or it might not be resonating with your current team in a way that's going to really gain traction. And so the biggest thing I put here is having that awareness and being able to acknowledge and recognize when you might be in this phase. And recognizing, are your players personally connected to the culture? And if they're not, that might be a situation where you got to reinvent or blow the whole thing up and kind of rebuild from there. So culture, when we look at it a little bit more specifically, what is it really? It's, I would say, the number one buzzword in organizational work overall. To me, culture kind of serves as the umbrella, and then there's a lot of words that fall under it. So when you actually look up the definition of culture, obviously people have kind of different philosophy on what exactly it means. But one that I found that I thought was pretty good was customs, arts, social institutions, and achievements of a particular nation, people, or other social group. And then someone also mentioned it's often moving in the same direction towards a common goal. And so that's what they like to coin as culture. And then, like I said, if that's the umbrella word, there's a lot of buzzwords that can then be associated with it. I put a handful of them on here, but obviously there's a lot more. Things like values, mission, vision, beliefs, and purpose. Obviously a lot of different components to what culture really is, but we know it's really that it factor that brings a group, organization, or a team, in a lot of our cases, from point A to point B. I kind of add a couple graphics here because I think it's also important to acknowledge that every team or every group has a point A and a point B. We've got somewhere we're trying to go. And what that process actually looks like can be very, very different from group to group and how we get there. But really what culture does, I believe, is that it serves as the catalyst in that process. And so if it's true that any group, regardless of how you're measuring these items, wants to get from point A to point B, I believe that culture is the catalyst. And so at risk of totally outing myself as a big nerd right now, I loved chemistry growing up, and I'll never forget kind of learning about catalyst and how interesting of a concept that was to me. And so what a catalyst is in chemistry is that it's actually a substance that you add to a chemical reaction. And what it does is it increases the rate of the reaction itself. And so if you want to think about it this way, it really streamlines the process of getting from that point A to point B, or to your end result. And so to me, that's how culture plays in with groups. And so on here, I actually wrote talent can win, and it most certainly does win. I wouldn't be surprised if 50% or more of championships are due solely because you've got a really, really talented team. But what it cannot do is it does not provide the meaning and the value behind the actual experience for your players. And that's what culture does. So again, you might have a talented group, and that's fantastic, and you might even win. But if you don't have culture at the base of what you do, at the foundation, it's really not going to provide that meaning and value that so many players walk away with years later and look back and wish they could do it all again. So today, I wanted to look a little bit more specifically at the actual assistant coach's role in team culture. And hopefully even as a head coach, I know some of you guys are probably listening as well, and hopefully there's bits and pieces that not only resonate with you, but that you can take moving forward as well, and kind of implement within your staffs and have conversations around. So the biggest thing to me today is when you're looking at team culture, what is our roles? I put on here, coaching staffs are the drivers. I think that it's really important to acknowledge that players are looking to us, and they're looking to us often. And so if we want to be the people that are creating a good, positive team culture environment, we need to be in the driver's seat of that. I also put that head coaches and assistant coaches on there. I think that we do have very different roles. It's not to say that there's not a lot of overlap as well. Obviously, coaches are coaches, and there's a lot of pieces we share. But obviously, for anyone who's been in both roles, it's very clear that those roles and responsibilities can look slightly different. So we'll parse that out a little bit as well. And at the bottom of this slide here, the real big question that I wanted answered when I thought about assistant coaches and our roles in team culture, I wanted to look a little bit closer at, well, what is it that assistant coaches bring to the table? What are those skill sets that we can actually utilize to help with team culture? And so to answer this question, I actually conducted my own survey. Again, if you didn't think I was a nerd before, you do now. So there's that. But yeah, so I put out a survey, and the question on it was just one question. And all I asked was, what are the most important characteristics of an assistant coach? I took that, I sent it to 30 or so coaches, and probably got about 25 responses. So appreciate everyone that did give me some feedback in that way, because you guys are really fueling and the backbone of this information here. And so what I asked is, can you please list the top three? And if there's a fourth or fifth skill set, can you also list those as kind of an option? And what I did is I then collaborated on all those answers and came up with these. And so the number one skill that, according to us as a coach's body, a good number of coaches said, the number one skill if we're going to be a successful assistant coach is that of those interpersonal skills. So this looked like a few different answers. It looked like effective communication and listening. It looked like connecting and building relationships or being approachable. I should mention too, it says 156% of coaches said this. I'm not great at math, but I'm not that bad at math to know that that looks like an odd number. It's not actually a typo. That 156% simply means that a coach who said effective communication is the number one skill may have also said being approachable is the number two most important skill, or connecting with players is the number two most important skill. And so these interpersonal skills they're just so important that people didn't only mention them once, but they might mention them 2 or 3 times in their responses. So I thought that was a really interesting part. Number two that coaches really mentioned was this idea of loyalty and trust. So that could be to the head coach, or it could be to the greater program. So both were mentioned. And then the number 3 most important skill for an assistant coach, according again to us as coaches, is to be a self-starter. So people talked about being a contributor, having initiative, having an opinion, that sort of thing. So we've made it very clear as coaches, both as head coaches and assistant coaches, that we want to have assistant coaches in the room who are going to step up and lead and say something when they feel inclined to. Other common mentions that were brought up was bringing positive energy. We believe that as assistant coaches in the women's hockey world, this is really important. So this could look like positivity. It could be creating that fun practice environment. It could be showing that you're driven, showing that you're passionate. But we have to bring that positive energy for our players to be successful. I also put on here hockey knowledge and IQ. You can see an asterisk by that. This was actually a really, really critical and very interesting point of all of this to me. So when it came to hockey knowledge and IQ, there were over 50 responses before that was mentioned once. I'm going to just say that again because I think it's important. Over 50 people responded with different skill sets before anyone mentioned hockey knowledge. And it's not to say that hockey knowledge isn't very important, because it obviously is. And we'll actually circle back on that in a few slides here. But what that was telling me is that while hockey knowledge is mentioned, it's definitely not in that top 3 most important pieces. You could be the smartest hockey brain in the whole room, right? And if you go to a player and you can't present it well or connect with them in a way that they understand what you're saying, that's where it gets tricky. And so, like I said, we'll circle back on that and look a little bit closer at that as well. The last little bullet here, as well as it relates to hockey knowledge, is kind of that willingness and eagerness to learn. Obviously, as assistant coaches, and I've been there often, a lot of times it is tricky to admit that, you might not know how best to run something, or you might not know where to go a certain direction with a drill. And so as it relates to hockey knowledge, it's really important to also know where our blind spots are, and to ask for help and to do that research. And so we'll circle back to that. Last little note here, and I'm stealing this from Ryan, I'll admit. As I kind of walked through this presentation with him and showed him some of this, he said, gosh, that looks like the coach's resume then, doesn't it? And I thought that was such a good point. If you're a head coach and you're looking at this slide right now, this is the hockey resume that, according to us across the country, we would say are the most important things to have. Obviously, job descriptions can look a lot of different ways, but according to the experts, if you will, this is the hockey resume that you want your assistant coaches to have. And so it's, I think, an important thing. The assistant coaches that are looking at this right now, this is still the coaching resume. So these are the 5 to 6 things that, if you're not good or well versed in these areas, let's find a way to get better in them, because these are the big critical pieces. What most people don't know about this survey is I sent it to players as well. I don't think I mentioned this to any of the coaches, but I also asked players. So I actually reached out to some of ours, and then asked them to spread it kind of freely to some other players that they knew that were playing Division I hockey. And again, I asked the exact same question the exact same way. I said, can you give me the top 3 most important skill sets of an assistant coach? And if you got a couple others as well, feel free to add those on. In their top 3, again, not a typo, 118% of players said interpersonal skills is far and wide the most important thing an assistant coach can bring to the table. So again, this can look like effective communication. It can look like listening. It can look like building those relationships. But again, when players mention it once, oftentimes they were mentioning once, twice, 3 times these different skill sets. Number 2, which was a shared top 5 with coaches, is to bring positive energy. A high percentage of players said that. So again, that's that creating that fun environment. It's being positive. It's bringing passion to the table. Our players want that, and they need that. They're asking for it. Number 3, this was actually mentioned really infrequently by coaches, and often when it was kind of that 4th or 5th skill set. But yet the players are saying this is so important, I would put in the top 3, is to have a player's perspective, or kind of have that shared lens with what players go through. And so this is a really important one, and again, one that I'll circle back to, so I won't talk about too much yet. The other common mentions that players brought up were taking initiative and having an opinion. So when you go back to that self-starter idea and having that opinion and finding your voice, our players want and need that from us too. It's not only one thing that coaches want that from coaches, but we have to find ways to do it for our players as well. The last thing they mentioned is providing honest and constructive feedback. Again, a really important area. They want that feedback. And again, according to the data, they want that feedback, and they want it in a way that's done really, really well with those interpersonal skills. Okay, so this is kind of the heart of the presentation. So if you're taking a nap or went to go get coffee or anything like that, this would be the takeaway areas I really would like people to think about as it relates to those skill sets that we just learned. So what I did is I looked at that data and I said, okay, well, if these are the things that coaches think that assistant coaches need to bring to the table, and players think it as well, how can we kind of consolidate those things into 5 key takeaways? So if you got a pen and paper and you feel inclined and feeling crazy on this Monday morning, now would be the time to take notes. So number 1, an assistant coach's role in team culture. What does it look like? How does it play out in real life? Number 1 is to take a seat at the table. So Sheryl Sandberg was the former COO of Google, and now she works at Facebook in the same role. Most people probably know her, especially the women. She's kind of, known to be one of the best women in leadership currently today. And she wrote Lean In and quite a few other books as well. And I'm actually going to steal this from Lean In. And so this is kind of the big premise of her book, is that it's really important that we take a seat at the table. And so she actually describes this story where she went to a business conference and she was actually in charge of running this business meeting. And so she goes into the breakout room and there's this big long conference table in there. And the participants are all, managers, CEOs, COOs of different companies. And as they start trickling in, a lot of the men start walking in and they sit around the table as they should. And what she noticed is the fewer women that walked in, they actually found seats that were set up at the edge of the room. And rather than coming and sitting at the table, they sat around the corners and the edges of the room. And Cheryl actually went as far as to, as soon as she kicked off the meeting, she actually welcomed all the women and encouraged them to come sit at the table. And they didn't, they just kind of dismissed it. And in her book, she writes about how she found those women after, and she said, it is so important that you guys actually take a seat at the table. And to me, as an assistant coach, this is so critical because there are daily opportunities for us metaphorically and literally that we can actually take a seat at the table. And whether that's in practice planning, coming up with ideas or drills, reporting back on an experience you had with a player, it's really, really important that we take initiative, we be that self-starter in our program. And again, I can speak from experience being an assistant coach in a couple different programs and different roles. It can be really tough to find your voice. And it's something that our staff talks about all the time. But it can be really, really tough as an assistant coach, especially when you feel like you're not in charge, to still find a way to lead. And so I think that's a big premise there, is just because you're not in charge doesn't mean you can't lead. And so how do we find those opportunities to find our voice, to share our opinion, especially around topics like culture or players' needs or individual perception of what's going on? And so that's a really critical thing, is you take a seat at the table. The second quote I actually stole from the same book. I think it's an important segue here. She says, don't expect that you'll get to the corner office by sitting on the sidelines. And I loved that too. I thought, as it relates to an assistant coach and developing a team culture, if you're not willing to sit at the table and have those conversations and make your voice heard, what's going to be really tough is ever moving into a bigger role. And so what she says is, if you want to get to that corner office, if you're an assistant coach and one day you want to become a head coach, if you don't practice these skills now, how are you ever going to set yourself up for success later? So again, number one is take a seat at the table. Number two, be a liaison between your players and your coaching staff. I don't think that this is new or crazy, information for anyone. We've all heard this in some capacity before. But being a liaison between the players and the staff is of critical importance for an assistant coach, especially as it relates to team culture. Oftentimes, players and coaches speak different languages, and it's no one's fault, but there's so much that goes miscommunicated. And so I think as an assistant coach, when we can be really dialed in and serve as that liaison in a really effective way, it only makes the group better. And so I actually want to kind of tell a story for those of you guys that know me better. I'm a big storyteller, and people probably hate that, but bear with me here. So I actually took sign language in college and really enjoyed it. And we'd have translators in the class. And I'll never forget, because there was one class period where they were just going to give a presentation and talk about what it's like to be a translator. And so this lady stands up and she's kind of explaining the process. And she says, for me, as a translator with sign language, she's like, there's not always direct words that go from English speaking and the hearing world to the deaf world. And she's like, so translating can be a little bit tricky sometimes. And she said, so what I do is I get a message from, person X, let's call them. I get this message and it looks like a present. And she says, I look at the present and I unwrap it so I know what the actual contents are of that present. So I unwrap it, I look at it, I understand the message that's trying to be communicated to the other side. And she goes, and then what I have to do sometimes is I repackage the message in a way that might look slightly different on the outside, but actually preserves the integrity of the message on the inside. And then I pass it along. And I think that this is a great analogy for coaches as well. Like there's going to be times that our players come to us and they might say something in a way that is tough, right? And we might hear it differently. And so I think, when they come to us and they have a certain type of message, it's not to manipulate the message or anything like that. It's simply to understand the message. And so when we can understand it, again, preserve the integrity of what's being said and pass it along to someone on the other side, whether it's a coach or a staff member, in a way that's best received, that's really important. And in particular, even more important, as assistant coaches, it is so critical that as a staff and with our head coaches, that we're passing along the same exact message that they want. And so whether it relates to team culture or anything else, it is our role to actually serve as that liaison in between. And actually pass it along in a way that creates a lot of clarity within our program. And again, I think it in particular is really, really important around team culture. Number 3, hopefully if you're still taking notes, you're bearing with me here. This is to have a coach's mind and also a player's lens. And I will admit, I think that this is a really, really hard balance, but it's a really important balance to be aware of. So as far as a coach's mind, this goes back to that hockey IQ that I mentioned a few slides ago. So what's really important here is that we understand the technical and the tactical of hockey. This can look like systems. It can look like, power play, penalty kill, forecheck. It could look like individual player development and skill development. But it is so critical that we do understand the technical and tactical. I mentioned this previously, but equally important to understanding that is probably maybe even more important to understand your blind spots. I put on here, be a learner. Obviously, as an assistant coach, there's plenty of times where I'm going to other coaches, and sometimes it's our own staff, and sometimes it's at Naples and the convention that we all wish we could have been at this year. And I'm going and I'm asking different people different hockey questions. So it's really important to know where your blind spots are and where you can become more of an active learner and be adamant in that process. And I put here, great hockey minds do not make great communicators, which is a shame, because obviously if we all just had the information and could just present it however we wanted to, it would make our jobs pretty easy. The challenge is to have that coach's mind, to have a really good understanding of the game, to watch hockey, to do the research so that we can present it in a way to our players that's helpful. And then again, it's all about how we present it as well. That's got to be paired with the player's lens. And again, this is something that the players mentioned that they want and they need from us to be successful. Know the pulse of the room is a quote that I'm sure everyone has heard before, but it's so, so critical, right? As a coach, we have to be able to walk in and know when the tenor is different. And if we don't, we're kind of actually doing a disservice for our team and our players. I think in conjunction with knowing the pulse of the room is there's going to be moments where you don't know the pulse of the room. And I know for me, when I feel off about that, I ask. I think that's really important, is that, I'm not going to have the same lived experience as anyone I work with, regardless of where that would be or who it would be with. And the same is true with our players. I don't understand their lived experience as much as I would like to on a day-to-day basis. And so when it comes to being kind of the expert, I need to know that at times they're going to be the experts. And when it comes to their own lives and their own experience, they're always going to be the experts. And so as coaches, even though we're looked at to have information, have knowledge, let's not be so quick to connect the gap on dots that maybe don't actually exist. Let's actually go to the experts and ask them themselves. So on here, I put inside the locker room. This is a personal philosophy of mine. I think the players are the experts. I think it's a little naive to say that the coaches are the experts of what's going on internally in the team. We obviously have a good understanding, and the more we ask, the more we know, but they're the experts in there. As soon as they walk outside the locker room, I think that's where they actually anticipate that we are the experts as coaches. And it's not to say that there's not going to be opportunities and times for players, frankly, be the experts on the ice, because they will be at moments as well. And it's not to say that as coaches, we can't be the expert in the locker room every once in a while too. But really think about who is the expert in the given situation and how can you get more information to make sure that the needs are being met of everybody. Number 4, positivity works. I really like this one in particular. I think that we've been working with a changing demographic of players, and the research has shown that too. A lot of what you'll read now is more on kind of a player's coach, which I think used to be viewed as a little bit more fluffy or soft. But what's interesting is that as the generations continue to move up, people are starting to challenge that a lot more and say, that old school traditional idea of kind of a dictatorship type of coaching style doesn't actually work anymore. And so positivity, especially as an assistant coach, it works. And so to kind of demonstrate a little bit along these lines, I'm actually going to ask people to do an activity, which I know is very odd, as this is a tough way to be interactive, but I'm going to ask that people do this with me. And so if you have heard me talk about this before, just bear with me, it'll only take a minute. But what I want people to do is on the other sides of your screen, I want you to close your eyes. And I know it's a goofy request, but I'm asking that everyone does it because I think it actually adds to the process. So for half of you that have not closed your eyes now, and just bear with me here. So what I want you to do is just follow along a storyline with me. So I want you to envision a family, and they're in a car, and they're just entering onto the highway, and it's around Christmas time. And so they're actually on their way to grandma's house for kind of this Christmas celebration. So they're in the car and they're driving. And you got, the parents sitting in the front seat, couple kids in the back, and things are really quiet, and the snow is falling, and it's this beautiful, beautiful night. So the snow's falling, they're driving, and kind of subtly in the background, they've got the music playing. And the song Jingle Bells actually starts to come on. And so what they do is they kind of slowly start to turn up Jingle Bells, and they're listening. It's this nice moment, and mom's looking at the kids and smiling, and they're driving down. And all of a sudden, they turn it up a little bit more, and now people are starting to hum and people are starting to sing. And before you know it, the whole family is outbursts singing Jingle Bells. And you can kind of see this visual. Everyone's looking at each other and smiling and laughing, and they're singing Jingle Bells. And all of a sudden the scene cuts. So you can open your eyes if you actually have them closed. And the question is, what happened? What happened when the scene cut? And if you're like the mass majority of Americans, actually, you say a car accident happened. And that's totally okay if you did. For the few that didn't, I would love to follow up with you after, so please reach out. But yeah, the mass majority, over 70% of Americans say a car accident happened or some other kind of catastrophic tragedy. They hit a deer or something like that. And so what's interesting when they actually did that study is that there is a reason that Americans say car accident. Part of it is experience and how we're raised in the movies we watch, absolutely. But the bigger part of it is that they've found this genetic tie to negativity with humans. And so this goes back to generations and generations ago. What would happen is that people that thought negatively were the ones that actually survived. So if you want to go way back when, think of the people that, they thought, I'm not going to find food tonight. I can't survive if I don't find food. Or they'd think, I can't find shelter. I need to find shelter. And they were having all these negative playouts in their head of what could happen. And then the people that were kind of indifferent and they're like, I'll find food, I'll find shelter, it's not a big deal. Those are actually the people that didn't make it. And so we've got years and years and years of kind of that negatively firing going on in our brain. That when we go under brain scans, we see that humans are still naturally negatively wired. It's how we operate, it's how we think. And so the big question with all of this is, if that's true, that we know that we're kind of prone to negativity, and we're coaches and we're working with players that are like that, then how can we be helpful? And the obvious answer goes back to being positive, right? And so when we know that our players are going to naturally be negative and frankly are probably going to be their own biggest critics, the question then becomes, how can we operate in a way to actually try to get them to the other side of the spectrum, especially when they're in a really, really bad spot in the middle of a game, middle of a practice? How do we stay positive enough and work with them well enough in that way to get them to the other side, or to a minimum, let's get them to baseline and let's get them neutral. The last part of this in the positivity works idea is I read this quote one time and I really liked it. And it was a kid and he was learning how to drive a car. And his parents were talking to him about that process. And they said, the biggest thing for you is that as you're learning to drive the car, dent the car, don't total it. And so their idea was, it's okay if you're parked in a parking garage and you get a little ding from a car next to you, or you get a small fender bender. But the big thing is you don't total the vehicle. For obvious reasons, that's a whole different world of issues. And so to really be able to create this culture of mistakes for our team, as assistant coaches, I think that we can be really critical to this piece. Obviously, with head coaches in particular, a lot of times it feels like there's a lot more tied overall to playing time, being weighed, power play, penalty kill, that sort of thing. And if as assistant coaches, we can create a culture of mistakes, of denting the car, and again, for hockey, that's going to look like maybe there's a small turnover in the offensive corner, or maybe they take a shot from an odd angle and miss the net. But don't total it, right? Like, don't take a slap shot from the point and send someone on a breakaway for the other team. So again, let's create this culture of mistakes where we say it's not only okay that you make mistakes, but we actually encourage you to, so that you can learn. But let's be really intentional in that process. Let's learn when making mistakes is actually a healthy thing versus detrimental to our group. Okay, last one here is to lead by example. I actually originally had a different fifth point, but the more I talked with Ryan, and he had so much good insight that he shared with me, the more I thought that this one had to be in here. So leading by example, I think is probably, if not the most important, it's got to be one of the most of these five. Because if you have your values, you have your team culture, it's really important that you live that out. Because our players, as you all know, they are very, very intelligent. They're very socially intelligent human beings, and they can see right through it when we're not living it out ourselves. And so it is really, really critical that we walk the talk. On here, I put be authentic. I think not only are we living out these team cultures and these values, but we have to be authentic in how we do it. It's okay to acknowledge and recognize others and model our behavior after other coaches, other people. But it's really important that at the end of the day, we're still us. On here, I added a quote from one of our players this year. So during our individual meetings, we were talking with all of our seniors, and in one of their meetings, I always ask if they want to coach, because I'd love to keep them involved in the game, obviously, if they can be. And so I asked her, I said, do you want to coach? And she said, I would absolutely love to coach. I was like, okay, that's great. Would you like to coach youth? Would you like to coach high school? What does that look like for you? And she said, gosh, I would love to coach high school hockey, but I don't know how to coach right. And it was interesting because it was coming from a really prolific hockey player, or kind of background experience on our team. She's a very, very talented hockey player. And it was funny that she said, I don't know how to coach right, because I immediately challenged that. And I said, well, the good news is nobody knows how to coach right, because it's not a one size fits all. And the same is true with team culture. There's not a one size fits all for any given group. And so if that's true, that, there's no perfect way to coach, then you better be authentically yourself. A second point I added with this, because I think it's an important thing to acknowledge as well, assistant coaches as it relates to the recruiting process as well. If you're going to lead by example, then you want to bring in players who are going to do the same as well, because you're spending every single day with these players from, September, hopefully this year, all the way through March. And so if you're going to live with these people and live out life with them on a day-to-day basis, you're going to want to bring in people that are living out in the same way that you are, same way that you're passionate about it. I put a quote on here: if it's not broken, don't fix it. Joel Johnson, who you all know works with our program, he always challenges that quote. And he actually has shared this with me and plenty of players and others. And it's one of my favorites that he said, and it's, if it's not broken, keep fixing it so it doesn't break. And I think it's a way better iteration of the same idea. And I think that really shows up in team culture as well. So when we're assistant coaches and we are so heavily involved in the recruiting process, it's really important that we actually bring in players that we know are bringing with them a set of culture that fixes itself. That way we don't have to do all the heavy lifting of that as coaches. If we bring in those players that we know are going to live it out, they're going to lead by example, they're going to model it with us, and they have the ability to fix itself as they see those problems develop, that's going to be huge and critical to our success. So this is just the last thing I have here. Can kind of see the underlying, that's one of my favorite photos in the back. That was my sophomore year. But, just as kind of a final parting thought on all of this, Ryan mentioned this and I wanted to write it down. on here, because I wrote down for myself too, and I wanted to share it. He said, good people make good culture. And I thought it was a simple way of putting it, but it was just the most direct way of saying it too. When you have good people, they're going to make good culture. And so recruit the right people in that way. And then the extension of that to me is if it's true that good people make good culture, then what I would argue is if you get the right group of people, that's how you make exceptional culture. That's all I got, Lindsay.
Amazing. That was incredible. Unfortunately, we've lost Ryan and he's having some technical issues getting back on.
Okay.
But the good news is there's a ton of great questions that have come in. So let's just launch into the Q&A. Hopefully we can get him back online. If we can't though, I know you guys have had lots of conversations back and forth. He'll catch the last 10 minutes of the recording of the presentation, and then we can have you join us on Friday too and kind of get that dialogue going that we've otherwise missed.
Perfect. Sounds good.
So, all right, let's launch into it. So the first question is from Allison Kumi. Awesome presentation, Bethany. You have a unique opportunity to coach for a program you played for and with coaches that you played for. What has been the biggest change that you have noticed in regards to team culture?
Oh, morning, Kumi. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I think, as it relates to kind of team culture, at least in my experience, it is very different as a player. Because you're just kind of living the culture out. And I think that feels very different because in some ways, at least for me, that felt like a much more natural process because we weren't necessarily involved in, well, what are our 4 values going to look like and how are we going to roll this out or what the presentations look like. So I think when I became a coach, that was probably the biggest difference is like, how are you on the other side of it? And now you're being very intentional and organized about it. And thinking about ways to actually implement it in a way that gains traction. I think as players, you're lucky in that you do the team building, you do the bonding, and there's kind of just that glue that naturally develops. Versus as a coach, you're trying to figure out what the glue is, and I think that's a way bigger challenge in some ways.
Okay. Caitlin Parker, great presentation and insight. Thank you for sharing. How do you balance the business side of hockey, wins and losses, with developing your student athletes as people, teammates, and values and team culture? And how do you as an assistant coach create this balance for your team?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Perks. I think that, that's a tough one. I think that it's easy to say and then a lot harder to live out. But at least in my experience, when you do start to actually put your energy and your focus on those other areas, I do think that the success of the team on the ice takes care of itself. And again, it's going to look different in every program depending on the talent that you have and that sort of thing. But, I think that the more you get away from focusing on the wins and losses, ironically, the more they do take care of themselves because all of a sudden you're putting in your energy to what does school look like? What do those academics look like? How are we as a group? Are we supporting one another? There's infinite areas that you can actually pour that energy into from a day-to-day live perspective. And I think that, what you'll find is, let's say you put a lot of energy into players connecting with each other and team bonding, right? Then all of a sudden they actually want to work a lot harder when it comes to practice and comes to a game. They're actually going to work in a way that you could have never actually created by running a certain type of drill. And so to me, maybe I'm too far on one extreme of this, but I believe as an assistant coach to continue to really bring attention to putting energy into all those other areas so that the on-ice stuff just takes care of itself later.
Okay. Question from Lee J. How have you been able to find your own blind spots? And do you have anything to help your players find theirs? If so, how?
Yeah, well, good question. I've got plenty of blind spots, so it's not hard for me to find them, Lee J. But yeah, no, I think for me, I think one thing I've been really intentional about in the last couple of years in particular, sounds really elementary, but to like write things down like crazy. So I always try to carry a notebook with me. And so when I hear really good things, a lot of times I'm like, oh, I've never heard that. That's important for me to write down. That's a blind spot right there. I also try to, after practices and stuff, if there's certain areas where I'm like, oh, I wasn't as comfortable drawing that up, or I realized, when we were running the power play, that wasn't something I thought about. I immediately go back after practice and I try to write those things down and make notes to actually learn a little bit more. And I think the tendency is when you do realize you have a blind spot, you want to push it away. I'm like anyone else in that way. But I think the more you can actually write it down, be accountable to it, maybe even like set some goals around it of how you're going to get better. That's how we get better. And I think the same is true for players as well. I think that plenty of times that, you work with a player, they do have blind spots. And I think the biggest thing with that, and this is just me personally, but I think when you go to a player and you lead in with that, I know our staff has talked a lot about this, but when you lead the conversation, kind of almost being vulnerable with them and sharing in it with them, that makes a big difference. So let's say I'm working with a certain player and I notice that her shot needs a lot of improvement. I might actually go up to her and I put myself in the boat with her. I'm like, hey, I've noticed that in games you're not seeming to get as many shots through. And one thing I remember looking back at college, I really wish I would have worked on my shot in this way more, because that was an area where I look back now years later and wish I was better. And I wish I had known this. And so I kind of put myself in the boat with them and kind of, get vulnerable with them and be like, hey, I'm not perfect either. Even as a coach, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm trying to share in a conversation. In my experience, I think that's the best way to kind of start those conversations.
Okay. Amanda Mizada says, thanks, Bep. I guess that's the nickname.
It is.
That was awesome. I realize culture isn't built in a day or week, but do you have any favorite team activities that you've done to help cultivate your culture?
Oh, team activities. Gosh, I go so back and forth on like the team building team activities, because I feel like you either do it and it's it's awesome and whatever, or you can do it and it's like super cheesy and they hate it. So I think the biggest thing is like not necessarily looking at team building as it has to be this, we're going to ask 3 questions and they're all going to share exactly the same. I think to me, team building and team bonding looks like just shared experience that's really enjoyable, right? So this year we went curling with the group, and people wouldn't necessarily think, oh, that's going to be this great bonding experience necessarily, but it was just a really good experience that created bonding, right? And so I would say the more you can just get your group to go out and do different things, the better off you'll be, or more opportunities you might have to develop those connections that otherwise wouldn't exist. Trying to think if there's, anything else in particular. But yeah, I think the other thing is, I described my sophomore year with that kind of tragic passing away of a teammate's sister. I think there's a lot of things that happen in life actually that can kind of create those connections within the team too. And they happen every single year with a group that's that big. And so I think it's really important to be aware of when there's actually hardship on the team, because a lot of people look at team building as positive always. It doesn't always look like that. A lot of times it's the hardship, it's those hard moments, it's after a loss. That's when actually the best team connection can come in. So really, as a coach, I think being aware of those moments and really honing in and building on those are important too.
Okay. Question from Mayor. When you were talking about recruiting character, I immediately thought about how early recruiting can and is impacting our ability to do this. Can you talk a little about the ways in which you start to instill Minnesota's culture in your committed recruits?
Oh, good question, Mayor. Yeah, I think that's a tough one. I'll be completely candid here in that, we've recruited just as young as plenty of other programs, and it's such a hard thing. I know I personally don't like it. We don't like it because all of a sudden you're talking to a kid who frankly doesn't even know what she wants to study when she gets older. And so it can be a really hard thing to get a gauge on who they are. And the biggest part of that has nothing to do with the player, but it has everything to do with the fact that they don't know who they are at that age either. And so I think when it comes to commitments, it's really doing your research ahead of time. And a lot of times that's going to look like talking to other coaches that have worked with those players before. It might be talking to, teammates. If you know some of them, a lot of times our current players know some of the up and coming kids and just their connection with them. And so really doing your due diligence to find out who that person is, not so much who they are as a player, but who they are as a person. And then once you have that established, I think, you're lucky in that if you do get someone to verbally commit and they're a junior or senior and you're getting to the age where you can actually communicate with them, That's where I think if you see the red flags, you have to address them, especially as a head coach, but as assistant coaches as well. Because as kids get older and they start to mature, you're going to see if they're in line with your culture. And then the big thing is you got to be able to call them to the carpet a little bit and have those conversations before they even get there so that they understand what the expectations are when they arrive on campus.
Okay, you just started to touch on something that's a question from Bill Bowe, so it's great. What ways do you utilize to evaluate the right player, the player with the good culture that you want? So what techniques do you use to learn more about the kind of person that player is and not just the kind of player that is easier to figure out while watching them play?
Yeah, really good question. And yeah, I agree. It definitely goes in line with Maris in some ways. I think it's really hard to say, kind of like the right type of player. And I think that sometimes you've got to balance it too with projection of who that player is going to be in your program from a hockey standpoint. So let's say you are recruiting someone who is probably going to project more to be a third line type of player. Well, that's someone who especially, they might be one of your most important culture people as well. Because, no one likes to admit this, but you might actually be looking at someone who could be a power play, penalty kill, first line type of player, who maybe isn't going to build your culture and create your culture in a really, upstanding, huge way, but they're probably not going to hurt it either. And so I think that's the balance, is knowing, where is this player going to fit in from a role perspective on your team, and how many of those players that you're bringing to the table are really going to be your culture builders. And you always need a few. And I would argue you absolutely need one or two in each class. And so I think that's the hard thing, is knowing when they're the right person. Again, I think that a lot of that comes to doing your research ahead of time and talking with people. But the other big encouragement would be to get to camps as much as possible, especially as assistant coaches. Gosh, you talk about our roles. Get to camps and be in a coaching position where you're really evaluating those types of things and you're asking other coaches, because it's very different to be on your best behavior for an hour at a camp where they play in one game versus you're actually the coach of their team for a week. And so I think both of those things, working on camps and then doing research with other people are probably the two biggest ways that I found to be successful.
Okay. Question from Melanie Ruzzi. Thanks, Bethany. Awesome. How much does it matter to your program that your top players are also leaders in living the team values? If those players fall short in that area, how do you address it and work towards it?
Yeah. Really good question, Mel. Good morning. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I think, it's absolutely critical that your top players at a minimum have buy-in. Like I said, I don't think necessarily that, your best player on your team has to be your best culture person. And frankly, I think that if you found that combination, that is like diamond in the rough. We actually, you'll probably be interested to hear this, but we actually did kind of like a reflective research in our own program. And we looked at all the different leaders and captains that came through our program. And as we looked a little bit closer at those people from over the years, there were, I think, three or four that were actually in like a top one line power play penalty kill type of role. And that was super interesting to us, because what we found is that, it was oftentimes more of those role players that were our exceptional leaders in our program through the last 20 years. And so I think that's the big thing, is your top players are not always going to be your culture leaders. And frankly, for whatever reason, it seems like those don't always necessarily go hand in hand. But you need them to at least be bought in at a minimum. Because if they're not, that's where it can cause issues. And that's where I know for us, we try to hold the player on the first line equally accountable to someone that we would hold accountable on the fourth line. So really treating your players universally the same across the board is really important in that way.
It looks like we've got Ryan back on audio, no video. Ryan, are you there? Just a really bad connection. So I'm going to mute you, Ryan.
I'm here. I'm trying.
Oh, there we go. Okay, we can hear you a bit. You know what? Bethany is killing it right now. So there we go. We got you back. So we just launched into the Q&A, tons of great questions. Bethany did a great job. I was going to say we could get you guys all back together on Friday too, and kind of have that dialogue after you've been able to kind of catch the last 20 minutes of her presentation as well. So I'll just keep plowing through the questions. We've got a bunch more, and Bethany, I'll ask them to you first, of course, and then Ryan, if there's anything that you feel you can add to sort of compare it, contrast to the NHL, that would be great. So next question is from Steph Moberg.
Yeah.
Bethany, great content here. You talk a lot about the player's lens. What have you found to be the best way to receive this information, through a leadership council, captains, or individual conversations?
Oh, another good question. You guys are full of good questions today. Yeah, I think it's to be honest, I think it's a both and situation. I think it's all the above. I think, I look back at some of the most insightful moments I've had as a coach in receiving information. And there have been plenty of them that have come from individual conversations on the bench after a practice. There have been plenty that have come from an individual set up, more professional meeting. There have been other ones that have come from the leadership group or things like that. And so I think that it's not so much where they come from, because Moberg, to your point, I think it's all of them. But I do believe that if you're trying to get that information, the most important thing you can do is ask. And I know that sounds really elementary, but you've got to be willing to ask and do it in a way that's really authentic, so that the players feel comfortable actually sharing that information. And so I think it can look a multitude of ways, but I would say if you put me in a corner and ask me to pick one, I think that the most important conversations, at least for me, come up organically around practice time. So that might be catching them in the hallway after they just did rehab, or it might be catching them at pregame skate after we lost the night before and we take a knee and we're just chatting. And so I think the more that you can kind of create those conversations in a natural, organic way, the more information that you're going to receive that's helpful.
Okay. Anything to add there, Ryan? I can't tell if you're frozen or if we've still got
No, do you have me? Yeah, so I think Bethany is exactly right. I think, you hear coaches talk about going through the room in the morning with a coffee and just getting off their computer now and, making their way through the room, talking to the players about their families, what's going on. And I think a lot of times you can get a lot of information over that cup of coffee, or just going through the training room or things like that. Bethany touched on the times on practice or things like that, but we spend so much time together as a large group. There's all these little conversations that you can use to get that info and that player's lens.
Okay. Question from Kelly Ryder. Do you do specific things or use specific resources to help further develop your leaders or culture drivers?
Yes, we definitely do. For us, we're really lucky. I'll admit that we work in a department that's got a ton of resources and things like that. So we actually have a leadership department within the athletic department. And so they do a lot of work with our players. We can have sports psychologists come in and talk and do some work in that way. Another thing that I particularly have a lot of interest in, I think it's really helpful, is doing assessments with groups. And kind of looking more at that individual perspective. So that could be a disc, it could be, a strong strengths inventory, it could be a lot of different things. But I think, any opportunity to kind of build awareness for your players around who they are and what they bring to the table. I think that's just the foundation, is to do something like an assessment, because ultimately what it does is it leads into those conversations, and the conversations are the most important. So that way, when there's a challenging moment or something, you can have a player go to another player and walk across the room to address a situation. And they can actually come at it with a little bit more awareness of who they are in that moment too, not just who the player on the receiving end is. And so it kind of makes it a little bit more collaborative in that way. And so I think that's a big thing. And then I've been, surprised pleasantly over the years too, to see how much players at the college level, women, really want feedback as well. And so as a coach, as assistant coaches in particular, the more feedback we can actually give to players, I think is huge, because they want it, they need it. So a lot of times, even if it's hard things to hear, to kind of tee it up and come to them with information that can be collaborative and conversational, I think is really helpful.
I think that's great. I think the feedback is important. I think it is. I think all those leaders continue to grow too. I think whether you're coming into college or you look at a 35-year-old man that's playing in the NHL, I think they always help guide them, but there has to be these experiences that they go through, the highs, the lows, the positives, the negatives. And I think the word you used was assess. You're always assessing, you're always trying to grow and learn from those. And, you know, you talked about your personal journey in your presentation. You talked about how it changed from the first year to the fourth year. And just how much those experiences help develop your leadership and therefore help to create and maintain your culture of your team.
Okay, Allison Kumi says, love the quote from Legacy. What are some ways you've changed your game in terms of culture?
Yeah, another good question. Yeah, I think that quote is so relevant, right? Is you got to keep changing things. You know, one area that just, again, pops to mind really quick, it's less about culture, but more just like in regards to our team. As I remember, there was a point where, especially actually as a player, I remember this happening a lot where we'd be, you know, our power play, let's say, was doing really, really well. And then the coaches would actually change it. And I remember, and granted, I was not a power play player, but as an upperclassman, I was like, oh, wait a minute, guys, like that doesn't make any sense. You know, like we're getting some traction, things are going well. Why are we changing it now? And so I think there's a lot of natural pushback from players oftentimes when you change things. I think that's part one of this. And part two, I think, you know, Kumi, to answer your question, I think where you change it, it's everywhere. There's obviously going to be bits and pieces of your culture that fundamentally stay the same. I think of, you know, values. We have the same 4 values. We've never changed those. You know, and I remember having a conversation with our staff about, well, you know, are these 4 values actually relevant to our current players? I don't know if they are, because we established them 8 years ago. I don't know if it resonates with them. And so that was a moment where, you know, what we actually came up with, well, let's have a 5th value and have it be a rotating value every month. And let's let the players choose that value so that they can connect to the culture in a new or different way. And so I think, like I said, there's parts of your culture that are kind of your fundamental, they're your foundation. They don't change at all. But then when it comes to, you know, where do we change it? I would argue you can change it everywhere, and change it in small ways and tweak and see if it works. Just because you try something new or try a new approach as a staff, maybe not all 3 coaches talk in between periods. Try having one person talk, see if it sticks. And so that's the good thing, is it's really fluid, and to be open to what works rather than we're going to change it and now we're going to start doing that for a whole year. Well, maybe change it, try it a few times, and then see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
No, that sounds good. I think your team is always changing, right? So the word tweak is your team's always getting tweaked, whether it's the seniors that are moving on in the NHL, it's trades, it's call-ups, injuries, all these kind of things are always tweaking. And when you gather your group at the start of the year, it could be a totally different group, because in the college world or in the junior hockey world, those leaders are moving on, right? They're usually your older players that are moving on now. That new group of leadership may have different values or priorities or personalities more than anything for how they want to approach things. So I think just from what I caught of that part of adding that fifth thing, and that's the ownership and giving that to the players is real key, because it makes it's a part of theirs.
A great question from Laura Schuler. So, and it gives some context for Ryan, because I know he had unfortunately dropped off during this part. But so the question is, Bethany has standing presentation. you talked about creating a culture that is not afraid to make mistakes, that it's okay to dent the car. But what do you do to help players and you not total the car? Is it decreasing playing time because of the same repeated car dents?
Yeah, good question. Good morning, Schuler. Yeah, I think that, when it comes to totaling the car, what I've always experienced, and I experienced this as a player too, is like, we know when we totaled the car, as a player, like, when you did. And so you usually don't even have to tell players, like the amount of times where, someone turns a puck over on the blue line, let's say, and they go the other way. If I go to a player on the bench after that shift, I kind of kneel down, get down to their level, and they're like, I know, like I've got to just chip and chase or whatever. And so I think that number one, players know, and going back to the negativity piece, they're going to be their own self-critic more so than we are in some ways. And so number one, give them permission to be their own self-critic first and foremost, and let them kind of learn in that experience. So a lot of times I'll ask what they think rather than tell them what I saw. So I'll say, what would you do differently there? And I'll see if they're seeing the same thing that I am as a coach. So give them permission to actually, when they do total the car, actually talk about it before you do. Because half the time they already know, and then the other half the time they don't, then it's a learning opportunity that you can work with them on. But to your point too, Schuler, like, if they're going to dent the car continuously, that's, to me, that is totaling the car, right? If you keep doing the same thing over and over again, that's the equivalent of totaling the car. And so if they keep making that same mistake and you've talked to them about it, yeah, that might be an opportunity where you sit them. And again, I think, sitting players is actually an appropriate thing, but it's all about, goes back to that communication. If you're going to sit a player, make sure you go up to him, you really explain it why. Because I think when we have information as players, we can do pretty well with it, and we understand why we're sitting. We're not going to like it, but we'll understand it. But when we don't have information and it's just like you're benched and you're not talked to for 2 periods, that's a very, very different experience.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear, Ryan, your thoughts on that too, having just been a player as well, not too long ago, and now being in the coaching role, what your thoughts are on that whole topic.
Yeah, no, I like the quote. I like the don't dent the car, don't total it. It's most good cars have a lot of dents. If you're getting a lot of mileage, you'll have a lot of dents. So, the one thing that I can relate it to with culture is you don't let anything fester. So, if there's a problem with the culture or something in your room, for the most part, take that dent. That dent can be repaired. But once it's totaled, you're too far gone. So just within the room and the culture and what you're trying to create, there's going to be dents, there's going to be bumps, there's going to be mishaps, whether it's on the ice, off the ice with your team. And it's how your team fixes that dent or addresses that dent that can lead to that car still working and not being totaled.
Okay, there's a few anonymous questions that have come in. So this one, Bethany, is just going to be specific to you because it's about recruiting. But you mentioned recruiting players that can be fixers. Some would say that is easier to do at the D1 level or when a positive culture is already in place. What would you say to a D3 or club programs who want this but find it hard to recruit and land those types of people?
Oh, that is such a hard question. I know. I've thought about this a lot, actually. And I've thought about it even from a Division I landscape of, let's say you became the head coach of a program where the culture just is terrible, and you're trying to rebuild it. You're in the same spot, right? And so I think that, my opinion is, and Ryan, I'm going to steal this from you, so I hope you're okay with this. And I know you're going to talk about this on Friday a little bit. But it's really about recruiting a bunch of the right people rather than the best players necessarily when you're in that spot. You obviously need talent to be performing well and to have a shot. But again, maybe I'm too far on one end of the spectrum with this, but I believe if you recruit a lot of good people, first and foremost, who are good hockey players, but maybe they're not quite as good as as the next player, if they bring with them a really good culture background and they bring a really good personality, they're actually going to from a standpoint of just the ripple effect they have throughout your team, they're going to actually create a lot more effectiveness overall on the ice. And so I think when you're building a program and trying to build positive team culture, whether it's D1 or D3, you've got to prioritize getting the right people first over the more talented players. So if you're looking at a talented kid and you know that they have an average personality, and you're looking at a slightly less talented kid, or even maybe, significantly a little bit less talented kid, but you know that they're exceptional, they're actually going to have a way higher impact in your program in a lot of ways through their ripple effect. So I think that's the biggest thing, is just continuing to actually recruit people and knowing that the talent's important, but knowing it's not the priority.
Ryan, feel free to jump in if there's anything you want to add on that one, or we can keep going through the last couple questions.
No, that was very well said.
Okay. What traits and qualities would you want to see in a head coach that you're working with?
Sorry, Lindsay, you cut out just a little bit.
What traits and qualities would you want to see in a head coach that you're working with?
Oh, that's a good question. I know I'm reiterating all the good questions here. I think for me, and this is my personal perspective, everyone's different. The biggest thing to me is open lines of communication. I think that when you're a head coach, it's really, really hard to create the same type of relationship that, let's say, your two assistant coaches have, because you just have a little bit different level of kind of overseeing and management and that sort of thing. So I think the best head coaches are ones that they're a head coach by position, but not by how they act. And so when you have a head coach that you can work with who has a really open line of communication, they're sharing with you in the experience, they ask for feedback too. That's another big thing I've realized over the years is when you're in management and you actually ask, a quote unquote subordinate for feedback, you have no idea what that does for your employee. When you say, it's actually, even though I'm in charge, I want to know what I can be better at. Now, all of a sudden, on the other side, I'm a lot more comfortable asking what I can be better at too. And so having really that open line of communication and kind of, like I said earlier, putting yourself in the boat with someone rather than just being in charge because you're the boss or because you're in charge. I would say that for me, at least, that would probably be at first blush the number one trait or skill set that I would hope a head coach could have, or that I eventually would like to have one day.
That's a great answer. And Ryan, you obviously went through a head coach change not too long ago this season. So curious to hear a bit about your perspective, and I'm sure you'll go into this more on Friday as well.
Yeah. No, well, I think when it was interesting to see the characteristics of the survey that Bethany did, and you see the interpersonal skills, and she talked about communication, and she talked about that kind of thing, the ability to listen, loyalty, being a self-starter. I think those are huge qualities in head coaches. Left off there, Bethany was going through 5 points, and that seat at the table just by the assistants. But are you allowed to have an opinion? Does your opinion count? Does it take into is it important for an assistant coach to feel like they're a part of it?
Okay. Couple last questions. Jess Kozumi, did I say that right?
Okay.
Crushed it, Bethany. Thank you. And happy birthday shout outs.
It was this weekend.
Oh, happy belated.
Thank you.
All right. Have you experienced a player or two that did not buy into the culture you are instilling, those energy vampires? And if so, how did you and your staff manage this? And what do you have in place in case it does happen?
Awesome. Thanks, Sumi. Yeah, I think we definitely have. I mean, we're not immune to that. Just like any program, you're obviously going to bring in players sometimes knowingly, where you're like, these might be a kind of a tough set of kids, but other times you have no idea until they get there. I experienced it both on the playing side, where we had some players on the team where I was like, this is just not a good situation. Like, how are we going to deal with this? And as a coach, I've had the same thing. I think in the most extreme version of that reality, there have been times where players have had to leave. And that was, a collaborative decision, and not like, hey, you're getting the boot. But again, it came back to those conversations of, is this the right fit for you? Because the way that you're behaving would not reflect the fact that this is a good fit. Do you fit in? Is this the right group? And that sort of thing. So in the most extreme circumstances, we've even had players that have left the program or decide not to come back, things like that. But more often than not, I think the big thing is, I've heard, again, Joel, not to get his head too big if he's listening here, but one thing he always talks about is, it's very, very different to get hit over the head with a 2x4 if it's on purpose, right? Like, if you know that someone's doing it, like they just tee it up and they hit you on purpose, that hurts in a different way than if they have it over their shoulder and they turn and accidentally hit you. And so to me, and I think to us as a program, it's, where is the intention with players that are challenging or are problematic? Are they doing it intentionally? Are they aware that they're doing these things? Versus, there's other ones that will explicitly, defy the team rules and things like that, just very, very intentionally. And so I think the two are different, right? If you have a player that you can work with, and in their heart of hearts that they're trying to get better, but maybe they're just immature, they're young, that's where I think it's actually really important as a coach. That might be the most important kid that you ever work with in their 4 years. And so I think, again, it just fundamentally comes down to, what is their intention? And if they're having problems and defying rules and things like that, you've got to ask yourself, are they doing it in a way that they can learn and grow? And if so, they're actually probably going to become a much better person in the program than someone who already came in as a good, upstanding person. And so it's really important to work with those people and not give up on them. But if it's a continued pattern and they're intentionally doing it and doing it in a way that they're, they know it's harming the team, that's where you got to step in a different way and make some decisions.
I like that analogy of the 2x4. That's a good metaphor.
Yeah, I know. I stole any good idea, Lindsay. Yeah, I've just stolen, and I can admit that.
As long as we can all admit it.
Right.
Lee J says, what was your original 5th characteristic? Can we have it as our bonus 6?
Oh gosh, Lee J, I don't even think it was that good that I remember it right now. I'd have to go back in the notes. But if it was any good, I promise I'll follow up with you on what it was.
Okay, last question. What are the top leadership or culture books that you've read?
Oh, that's a good question. I obviously liked Lean In. I referenced that one. I liked Legacy a lot. Good to Great is another one that I've read. Here we go. Culture Code. This will be a shout out to a handful of people on the call. We have a book club going, and we're reading Culture Code. This is very good as well. That one speaks a little bit more to kind of the vulnerability and that with players. I think there's a lot of overlap there. But yeah, if you're looking for a specific list, I mean, again, like the nerd thing is just on the table at this point. I've got a whole spreadsheet of different books and podcasts and things I've read. So please reach out if anyone wants some suggestions, because like I said, I've got a whole list and I'm happy to share with anyone.
Awesome. Okay, well, we lost Ryan again. For those besides Bethany and me, he moved this weekend 5 doors down, and apparently there is no Wi-Fi signal 5 doors down from where he apparently was before. So we will get that fixed up on Friday. Bethany would love to have you on Friday too, so we can still get that conversation going, because I think it's so valuable to have seen the connection that you guys have built together and the dialogue. So thank you so much for your time today. That was amazing. So much great information learned. Is there anything you want to leave everyone with before we sign off?
No, I don't think anything in particular. I just, like I said, I think it's kind of been a weird time of life for me and everyone. And so I think the silver lining is that, we're all coming together in a new and different way, especially with this stuff. And so whether that's that's reaching out to me or to anyone. Just important to keep those connections. And Lindsay, like I said in the beginning, we just so appreciate you guys involving us. It's been a pretty incredible process to have the women's hockey world involved with the NHL in this capacity. So it means the world to us, and we really appreciate it. So thank you again.
It's been honestly my pleasure. I'm going to miss doing these each week, so we'll have to figure out a way to keep it going next season. So thank you, Bethany. Again, tons of great information. Thanks to Mare. We'll hear from her on Friday too. Have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you Friday morning. Bye.